Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Abuna, and thank you everybody for attending our presentation today and this series. I'm going to be sharing my screen, and hopefully you all can see that. All right. So I appreciate this opportunity to be able to speak to you all about how to help our children to positively parent them towards mental wellness and towards resilience. And the mental wellness piece, hopefully, and the resilience piece will come towards the end of this presentation and tie it nicely together, tie the series nicely together. So my goal today is to talk mostly about the younger children and talk a little bit about how they can be strong-willed and how that can create some issues. But hopefully our journey will take us over the next 3 Wednesdays towards more resilience and towards more mental wellness. So the purpose of today is really to kind of start creating a spiritual and psychological guide to creating our children to be well balanced, to be more resilient, to be more spiritually strong. And again, our journey will be to understand them first and then to produce resilience in the children we are entrusted with. So just to break down what we will be talking about over the next 3 lessons, the first lesson will be about learning what our plans are for our kids and how those coincide with God's plans. Also understanding our children holistically from a biopsychosocial and spiritual perspective, and then understanding specifically this time childhood, early childhood, understanding what happens kind of in their minds as well as their growth and their thinking processes, all the way up until the preteen age, which is about 13 years old. Here in the States, that's in the middle of middle school, and then we have a 4-year high school period that's coming up later, and that will be the focus of kind of lesson 2. But also in this first part, we will be talking about strong-willed children, because sometimes those children are unfortunately seen as stubborn or obstinate, and they don't cooperate with people. And so I wanted to describe where that kind of comes from, and then how we're going to, again, guide them towards resilience as they get a little bit older. In the second lesson, which will be next Wednesday, we will be talking about teens and adolescents, where there's a lot of changes that are occurring, specifically biologically and hormonally, that may cause a lot of behavioral difficulties and challenges. And also they're going through a lot of social changes as well. And so that may create some difficulty in our children also. And so we're going to be discussing each of these in that section, the second talk. Also, how to strengthen communication and relationships between parents and maybe their teachers and servants and things like that, how to create behavioral and emotional assistance. And then maybe sometimes, and some of the intergenerational or cultural or even ethical challenges that may come up with different generations living in the same home, and maybe even different cultures with children being raised in the West and the parents haven't been raised in Egypt. So we'll talk about that next time, as well as spiritual challenges. And then in the third lesson, we will be talking about as they grow into adulthood and how to create conversation and relationships with children as they get older. And then through the lifespan, how to discuss creating good, positive, what are called SMART goals, positive parenting skills across the lifespan, and then understanding how stress can affect mental, physical, and spiritual health, as well as building a muscle of resilience through the lifespan. So as your children get older, how to communicate with them as they turn into adults and obviously much more independent and on their own and starting their own lives. So for this first lesson, we will focus only on children and pre-adolescents up to age 13 or so. And we have to think about what are the goals that we have for our children. Is it to be more responsible? Is it to have a greater spiritual life? Is it to have academic or career success? Is it to have more healthy relationships, greater emotional health or greater well-being, or a greater, more meaningful life, or moral values? Are all those included in your list of goals for your children as they develop and grow older? regardless of what our goals are, God has a promise for each of us and for our children that he knows that he has the plans for us and plans to prosper, to give us hope, and to give us a future. And so those are the ultimate goals that God has for us. And we have to keep this kind of in our mind as we are developing and growing our children, to grow them spiritually, as well as psychologically, as well as emotionally and spiritually as well. So in order to do that, in order to help our kids reach God's plan to prosper and to have a hopeful future, we have to understand them holistically. We have to understand where they are developmentally. We have to understand that they face stressors. Their stressors are different than adult stressors, but sometimes the misconception is they're younger, so they don't have any stressors. And that is purely a myth. Of course, they have stressors. It's just different than the stressors that adults face. So we want to learn more about those pressures. We want to have difficult conversations with our kids, but to make sure that those conversations are productive. And in the second and third lecture, we will be talking more about that as well. We want to understand again what the strong-willed child is, and not to discount them as just being stubborn or obstinate or destructive or something like this. We want to understand them, what is happening in their brain. And so to understand them means to help them to thrive the best that they can. And the ultimate goal of all of this is to help them to thrive as best as, again, God designed them to be. We each have a purpose. We each have goals. And again, that verse from Jeremiah kind of solidifies that thinking in our mind. So we want to balance, by the end of the 3 lectures, stress with coping mechanisms and give them the ability to be more resilient. And understand healthy ways to express their emotions, and to give them a basis of roots and wings. And I'll talk a lot about that today, what roots and wings means, but also to encourage a relationship, obviously, with God, and to know his will, and to help them spiritually as well. So what is mental wellness? I know that this is a word that's kind of thrown around a lot, but basically it is a resource, a reservoir of resources that we have inside of us that help us in how to think and to feel and to connect and to function with the world around us. Our ultimate goal is to be more resilient, and we will see that resilience is a muscle to be built. It is not something that is just going to develop overnight or to grow overnight, but it is something that we grow and flourish with time. And ultimately, we want to help our kids with their thinking, with connecting to others, with their feelings and regulating their emotions and their feelings, and also with their functioning in their schooling, in their academics, eventually in their career, eventually in their own families. And so this is a process of being well holistically, mentally, physically, socially, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. So we need to understand our kids holistically. I've already said this a lot, but again, the interior of the combination of these is where mental wellness lies. So we have to be concerned about their physical health. We have to be concerned about their social health, with their relationships that they're involved in, with their peers, with their social groups, with their church, with their servants. Also psychologically, do they have good coping skills and social skills and family relationships, good self-esteem? Those are all psychological points. And obviously, from a spiritual perspective, we want to consider their spiritual health and how well they're connecting to God and understanding God and God's will for their life. And even when things get a little bit difficult or a little bit challenging, how do they use God to help them through those challenges? So here are some of the most common stressors in children and adolescents. We won't be covering each and every one of these today or through the 3 lectures, but just generally, this is some of the biggest things I've seen in practice and in research, and even when talking with my students. It's issues related to self-esteem, with puberty, with bullying, mental health issues, even substance use, peer pressure, a lot of cyber addictions nowadays, with all these devices that are around them 24/7. The bullying can come through these devices, and so we have to be aware of that as well. Relationships, academic stressors, all of these things affect their mental health, their mental well-being, and even their spiritual well-being, as they may not be able to understand what their purpose is, or understand or see these things. So they're going through a lot of stress. Again, sometimes there's the misconception that just because they are children, that they don't have stressors. And so it's really important that they kind of navigate each of these areas as they grow up and as they develop into adulthood. If we don't pay attention to those stressors from the last screen, you will see children that have a lot of stresses and their coping mechanisms will be either non-existent or weak or not helpful enough to help them through their struggles. And so stress is not always bad. All right, so I always show this slide in the beginning of these talks because we sometimes think of stress and we think automatically bad. Stress can be healthy if it is a motivator, if they have enough coping skills to manage the stress, if they are focused. This can all help them to have healthy amount of stress that will motivate them and keep them focused on what they need to do. Stress in the green and yellow is that healthy kind of stress. As we move into orange and red, this is where stress becomes problematic because people become fatigued, they become exhausted, they become panicked, they're burned out or overloaded because they don't have the right tools to help them to manage their stress. It isn't practical to say that somebody will go through the lifespan without any stress. That is not practical and everybody will experience stress. But we don't want people to get into the red and orange zone because then their coping skills are depleted and they're unable to manage their stressors. And so again, by the end of the series, hopefully we will help people to stay in the green and in the yellow. You can identify if your children have stress based on these 4 things. They have body signs of stress, feeling signs of stress, behavioral or thinking signs of stress, and they usually look like this. I'll get a lot of clients sometimes that have no medical explanation for stomach issues or headaches or even skin irritations, and those will all be related to stress, or they can't sleep, or they have no appetite, or they're leaning on substances to help them to cope with their stressors, whether it's, alcohol or tobacco or more serious substances. So we want to pay attention to those signs because they're ways that people deal with stress, obviously incorrectly. And so again, by the end of the series, hopefully we will try to move away from these kinds of expressions of stress to more healthy alleviations of our stress. Also, another problem is that stress creates distorted messages where sometimes people will look like they're okay on the outside, perfectly smiling, everything is fine, but they're really distressed on the inside with negative messages of hopelessness or brokenness, or I feel inadequate or useless. And these are the things that obviously lead to mental health difficulties and mental health challenges, anxiety, depression, and things even worse than that. So first, I want to say that mental distress is not always related to sin, and it is not a sin in and of itself. Jesus himself cried. Jesus probably himself felt anguish in the Garden of Gethsemane, but how we deal with that is what is important. So it is not about a lack of faith or a weakness or something that is you just snap out of if you think differently. And sometimes people need assistance through therapy or help from a doctor or a buna or the church, et cetera, usually working together to help them to come out of that situation. These are all signs that mental health is an issue, is when there's a change in somebody's emotions or feelings, if they've lost interest in an activity for at least 2 weeks at a time that they used to enjoy, if they've changed their sleeping habits or appetite habits, if they have low energy or uncontrollable emotions. These again are all signs that somebody's in distress and needs extra help. The good news is whenever I see a patient or a client, we have seen them across the spectrum. We've seen people that are really well, that just want to maintain their mental health, and people all the way on the unwell side that desperately need help at this point in time to recover and come back to wellness. So the good news is we can treat and help people all along that spectrum, but just like with any other medical disorder, the earlier that you come in, the better the prognosis and the sooner you will feel better and get help. So try to come in as close to, again, green or yellow and not so much the orange or the red. All right. So our job as parents is to be a light and a guide. Several years ago, I went to Maine and there was this beautiful lighthouse on the harbor. And obviously we know the job of a lighthouse is to bring ships into harbor, especially when there is stormy seas or there is a storm of some sort or fogginess. And our job as parents is sometimes like that, to navigate and to help them through stormy and difficult times. This was a beautiful sunny day when I went. And so the lighthouse has really less purpose on a day like this. But when you go inside of this lighthouse, there's a museum that talked about a major disaster that happened in 1864 when the lighthouse was doing its normal job, but it was a foggy, stormy night. And there was a major disaster that occurred here. 20 lives, unfortunately, were lost, and millions of dollars worth of property was destroyed. So as a result of this accident, they had to build the lighthouse, this exact lighthouse, even higher, even taller, so it can do its job even more efficiently. So unfortunately, sometimes as parents, we think we are doing the correct job, guiding these ships into harbor in stormy seas. And until there's a major disaster, we don't notice what is happening around us, that we're not actually doing the job that we should be doing, and it creates a major problem. And so we have to pay attention throughout our parenting. We can't just do it without paying attention, or think that we're doing the right things and just going along with the motions, but not really doing what we're supposed to do. And it's important that we take time to take balance, to have an inventory of our life and be balanced, to be patient, to be understanding, and to be perseverant. So just down the harbor from where this lighthouse was, these people were building these amazing sculptures just based out of rocks. And it really shows the importance of balance in order for things to be done correctly and to be done well. And that takes perseverance and patience in order for that to happen. But if we do it correctly, we will utilize the fruits of the Spirit and create a fruitful tree, namely our children, as they grow older and grow bigger into adults themselves. And the good news is you don't have to do this alone. You should create a village for yourself with the church, with other servants, with other parents, with family members, with good friends that have similar values, with our priests, with doctors, psychologists, and create this village that will help you to raise your child. Obviously, your values are going to be the most important, but if you create this village, it won't feel so overwhelming and like you're doing it alone. And so it's really important to know that it's not what you do for your children that makes them into good adults. It's what you teach them to successfully do for themselves. And the roots and wings concept is really important here. An American journalist and author named Hooding Carter came up with this wonderful quote that said the two lasting things that we give to our children is roots, the roots that we instill in them with our values, with our connections, with all of these things, but also with the wings that we give them to fly and explore and create and become adults eventually. So if you've established good roots, you have to give them the wings to fly as well. You can't have one without the other. Both are necessary to grow healthy and mentally well-balanced children into adults. So the things that we can do is that we can build optimism to help our children to create a positive future for themselves. By the end of this series, we will teach how resilience is important. There's a complex definition to this, but it's simply said that this is the way that we bounce back once we've had a tough time, once there's been a challenge, once there has been a stressor. This is an entire science, and so it's something that has been studied extensively over the last 45 years or so, scientifically, but has also been described by philosophers, by stories in the Bible. You can see resilience in lots of those. But scientifically, it's been studied over the last 45, 46 years or so. We want to teach them that they have strengths and that we're not going to just focus on their negatives or their weaknesses, but we're going to help them to thrive through the strengths that they have. And we're going to build their abilities rather than just focus on their weaknesses. And it's a privilege for us to be able to do this. We should teach our kids, which is just giving them knowledge and causing them to know things, but it's also we have to be proactive. And so we teach and we train our kids, and training is a little bit more difficult because we have to be proactive in doing so. This is giving them instruction and discipline and teaching them skills to help them to grow into the adults we want them to be. So again, let's turn all of this around and focus on children and tweens today. So we will focus up until about age 13 or 14, and next time we will focus on adolescents and adults. Okay, so some of the gifts of young children. is that they're very innocent. They have no awareness of the burdens that adults carry. And these are gifts that our children have that adults lose with time as they age. They're also very open to the future. They're not constrained by the plans that adults make or expectations. They have a lot of creativity. They're very open to the future. Again, this is something that we lose with time. And they also lack a focus of time, and they don't think that time is scarce and can be wasted. So this is why you're always telling your kids, let's go, we're late, we have to go. They have this lack of focus of time. And these are wonderful gifts. It helps them to be creative and to be open to the world around them. But how do I teach them to be prepared for adulthood without dampening these gifts? And that is the ultimate dilemma of this age group. We don't want to undermine their innocence. We don't want to undermine their simplicity. We don't want to undermine their spontaneity. But at the same time, we want to train them to become good, positive adults. So pay attention to the messages that you're giving them within this biopsychosocial and spiritual perspective. Do you always use these you messages? You never clean your room. You are never like your sibling. You are always the one who is last to leave the house in the morning when we're going to school. These always and never messages become a self-fulfilling prophecy for them. And they start to believe that these all-knowing adults must see me very negatively. And this is why they're always pointing the finger and saying, you did this and you did that. We're not focused at all at their strengths and what they're doing well. We're only focusing on what they're doing poorly. And we also have to be aware of what our body language is telling them, because 80% of our communication is body language. So if you're looking at them in a stern way, or you're pointing your finger at them all the time, and especially when they're at this very young age, you're kind of towering over them and you look like this big scary person and is always critical of who they are. So be careful of these messages that you're delivering, that they're not always negative, and that you're starting to infuse some positivity as well. We know from research that children that are happy are children that have a lot of love, especially at this very young age. They really respond to lots of talking, lots of repeating, even singing. They respond to music. They respond to physical affection. Being kissed and hugged is really important for them to thrive, and creating eye contact, especially in these younger years. And research also tells us that physical affection drops after 3 main periods in their life: when nursing stops, when another child is born into the family, and as they move into their teen years. But again, humans need touch. They crave affection in that regard. And so what better way than to show that to your children, especially your younger children. Happy children also, from research, it tells us that they have words that can help them to express their emotions. So giving them the right vocabulary is really, really important. Giving them a reason to connect to why they feel what they feel, not just walking around in a grumpy kind of way without understanding what they're feeling. And for teens, that's much more common. Teens and tweens, they don't necessarily know why they're feeling what they're feeling. But with younger kids, you can start to teach them how to express themselves. Happy children are those that are heard and accepted by their families, that they have parents that understand what they're going through and can put themselves in their children's shoes. And sometimes parents feel that they should not do this because they're the all-powerful, all-knowing adult, and why should I bring myself to the level of my child? But again, research shows us that the more empathetic and heard a child feels, the happier they become. Also, parents, that you're also human, and so you're going to make mistakes at times. Apologize when you do, and teach them that it is okay to apologize, and this is the correct way to do so. Help them to reframe things from negative to positive. Help them to talk through things, and help them to problem solve through things, which also builds their confidence. So these are main things that can help children to grow into happy, joyful children. Because they have people around them that understand them and help them to navigate difficult things. So let's talk about through the lifespan, at least through the beginning of adulthood, just real quickly. In the beginning, children, obviously babies, are 100% dependent on other people. People are, changing them when they need to be changed. They're feeding them when they need to be fed. And so they're 100% reliant on other people. So that 0 to 6 month period is a time to really start trusting others, that I know when I cry, somebody's going to bring me food. or is going to change me. And so it's really important to build the trust from literally day one, that you are responding to your child, you're making eye contact with them, you're singing to them, holding them, talking to them, etc. By 6 to 18 months, they're crawling around and they're developing an exploration of the world by touching and feeling things and understanding the texture of things and how things are in the world around them. And by age 3, they're really learning to understand limits. They're learning how to think on their own. And they're starting a very slow shift from independence, that should say from independence to dependence. Sorry for the typo there. So they're learning to shift from independence to dependence at this age. Some kids by 3 are going to preschool. They're learning how to be even more independent. So they're shifting again from dependence to independence, and they're learning to rely on other people. Maybe they're preschool teachers or people that are babysitting them or taking care of them. And by age 6, when they enter kindergarten or so, they're really learning how to interact with others. They're learning limits with their peers. I can't just grab a pencil that I want to use. I have to ask first, and I have to learn how to be polite. So this is an age period where they're learning to interact with other people. They're also learning up until those middle school years how to start negotiating. They're learning about rules. They're learning about due dates for assignments. They're learning how to compromise maybe with their teachers and their peers. And by the time they've reached middle school and this tween period, they're really practicing how to be an adult. So they're learning things like money management and negotiating and learning how to spend wisely and all of the things that you're learning as you're becoming more and more of an adult. So this is more an example of this just broken down into more detail. It starts off with more play and more learning about their world. And as they get older, it gets into more complexities with friendships, awareness of their body, greater independence, and craving both independence and still craving their parents' care, a lot more complex thought. They're thinking more about, they can sense more what is hypocritical and they're thinking more deeply and more abstractly, not just concretely. And they're learning about a healthy body and a healthy mind in all of this process. So you as parents have to spend a lot of time figuring out how to be a good example. You have to be clear about what your values are, what your dreams are for them. A lot of times kids get into these gender roles of, for example, only boys can be engineers, but you see a child who's interested in math and science and she's a girl. So be aware of these kinds of things and not just discounting somebody because she's a girl or because she's a boy, for example. Setting a good example is really most important for the parents. Yes, they spend time in church, they spend time in school, they spend time with friends, but they're going to spend the most time with their parents. So you have to set a good example. You have to be a good role model. You have to foster a good body image. And again, helping them to explore a wide range of things and not just say these activities are, just engineering or math and science, for example, are just for boys. They should be for girls as well. That's just one example. And then as we approach as young as 8, believe it or not, so in the middle of this time period we're talking about, puberty can start as young as 8, but usually the average age is around 11. There's a lot of body and hormonal changes that are occurring here. In girls, this tends to create a lot of moodiness and up and down emotions, especially as they reach the end of that tween period, 13, 14 years old. For boys, they may be more impulsive. It's also really important to know that the brain continues to develop, especially the frontal lobe part of the brain, which is the front part of the brain. I'm kind of pointing to it if you can see me. This front part of the brain continues to develop until about age 25 or 26. So if you see these kids are impulsive, they're moody, they're all over the place, they're sweet and kind one minute and angry and frustrated the next. It's all due to the brain still developing until about age 25 or 26. So be patient, be perseverant, be kind, be understanding of these. You have to be calm in and of yourself as well in order for them to learn how to be kind as well. They may question who they are. They'll have a different image at church than they are at school, than they are at home. And that's because, again, they're trying lots of different things. And we'll talk more about that with adolescents next time. There's questions about their appearance, their self-confidence. And so they need lots of good mentors at this age to help them to navigate different challenges. You want them to have friends that have similarities to them in values, and help them to navigate this very confusing, very challenging time. But again, when they're younger, this stuff is not happening as much. This is occurring at about 11 and older. So you have to maintain a good family unit. You have to have, kind of conversations or democracy at home, but still lots of rules. You have to give them lots of love, but lots of rules as well. Talk to them about whatever difficult subjects, and we'll talk about that in the next 2 sessions about how to talk to them about challenging things, but be their anchor during these difficult conversations and be the perfect example of love, and cherish and foster your relationship with them, and also cherish and foster the relationship with God. Above all, your job is to love them, protect them, teach them, model for them, and support them. Because again, there's a lot of fluctuations that are happening in this age period, especially as they approach their teen years. So as we raise school age children, they start right from the get-go, right from when they start school, to focus more on their peer groups. And they're beginning to be less and less connected with their parents. That does not mean at all that the parent influence disappears. In fact, your influence should increase, but slowly giving them more and more autonomy and trust. And when they make a mistake, you bring them back and you talk to them about how we can fix this mistake and create a real solid foundation in your relationship so they can trust you with more and more serious things as they get older. But right from the get-go, their friendships begin to be more and more important. Again, there's emotional and social changes. There's learning and thinking changes. Their mental skills are developing more and more. Like I said, they pick up more on hypocrisy. So if you're telling them to go to church and you're not going to church, they're going to start picking up on that hypocrisy very quickly, as they approach the end of those tween years. If you're concerned with other people, they will too. Again, you are supposed to be their role model, and again, understand the importance of their friends in their life at this age. There's some things that parents need to stop doing. The first thing is, are you too hands-on? Are you preventing them from learning how to problem solve on their own? As soon as there's a problem, you go in and you rescue. You should help, you should guide, but if you're solving every problem for them, they're not going to be able to learn to solve problems on their own. So otherwise, parents can be too micromanaging of everything that they're doing, or they can take the child's side and defend them blindly without realizing that there may be problems that your teacher sees that you're not seeing at home. And so pay attention to those things as well. So stay connected with them, but not hover so closely that they're not learning to problem solve on their own. Again, you're trying to move from dependence to independence as they get older, little by little by little. So as you're approaching tweens, these are kids that learn a lot better in small groups. They're starting to be more curious. The friends piece is becoming more and more of a stronger influence. They're no longer thinking in just black and white. It's not just good or bad. They see a lot more gray area at this age. And their emotional development is increasing as well. They may start to be involved in some risky behaviors because they want to fit into their peer group. And again, this is getting stronger and stronger as they are approaching the end of this tween period. And obviously they're physically developing, and they may develop slower or faster than their peers at this age, which may also cause some psychological issues or some questions or things like that that you should be aware of. So the well-rounded parent is a parent that stays connected with their children. They foster a good connection. They help them to problem solve. They resist the overscheduling. They should limit their electronics, see that their friends have similar values and good relationships with your kids. They should also hold good family meetings regularly, just like you do at work. You have a meeting so you're all on the same page. You should have a meeting so that your family is all on the same page and that you're exhibiting good values and more discipline and more self-control. This is a similar thing to that last slide. So if you have a strong-willed child, those children are almost hardwired that way, but we can guide them with these 5 things. I will get to 5 in the next 2 lectures, but let me quickly go through 1 through 4, because it's important to understand that these kids are not stubborn. They have a lot of good qualities. We just have to understand how to tap into those good qualities. So strong-willed children are those kids that are determined to do whatever they want, no matter how many people advise against it. Obviously, this can be perceived as something that is not good. They're strong-minded, they're stubborn, they're unwilling to kind of bend to adult rules. And so they're seen as stubborn or bossy or demanding or having a strong preference for things, or they're argumentative. They could also be seen as intense or challenging of boundaries, or they can be seen as short-tempered. So we have to understand that these kids may have those qualities, but they also are enthusiastic, they're energetic, they're joyful, they're very passionate, they're born leaders, and they're curious and fierce. And yes, while these kids tend to be more intense and have a strong-willed mind, they have good traits that can serve them well in the future. Because they have such a strong character, they're very passionate about things. They love harder and deeper. And so those are the qualities that we need to tap into, not just calling them stubborn or difficult or whatever else that we can call them. So strong-willed children are biologically based that way. They are hardwired to be this way. That doesn't mean that we can't mold them and change them a little bit to help them to interact with other people a little bit better. Yes, their emotions are big, but they're also very happy kids. They also love to explore the world around them, and we can use those qualities to help them to grow in a healthy manner. So think about it, all people are born with a certain temperament. For some children, they are cautious, and some kids are very cautious. But now we are trying to figure out, we're starting to see more through research that there's a third group of kids, and these are the kids with the strong-willed or exuberant temperament. So they're strong, but they just need to be molded. They need to be guided correctly. So again, this is how your child is hardwired if they're in this category. And it's been shown that it's associated with, again, the right frontal lobe of their brain. But it does not equal bad. It's just how we reframe and we change our thinking about things. So it doesn't predict how they will turn out. It predicts how they may learn, how they may react to situations with these giant big emotions, how they may behave and act out a little bit, or they may feel really intense. But it has no indication on how they will be as adults or how they will be when they grow up. So we want to change the label. We want to reframe what we're thinking with these kids. Instead of calling them demanding, we want to empower them and say that they have leadership skills. Instead of saying they're stubborn, we want to say that they're persistent. Instead of saying they're defiant, we want to say they're independent. Instead of saying they're single-minded, we want to say they're focused in their attention. Because again, they can be enthusiastic and joyful and even happy, but we just need to mold them a little bit. We want to stop these negative thinking patterns that we have about these kids and think of an alternative way to think. Pinpoint exactly what they're getting upset about, get as close to as specific as possible, and then reframe that into something else. So let's say they don't clean their room, and you're really upset about the fact that they don't clean their room. So instead of saying, you never obey me, you never listen, I've told you to clean your room 1,000 times, you don't listen. Let's say, okay, I see that you started on a corner over here. Let me help you start with this corner, and then I'm certain that you can do the rest on your own. So start it with them and reframe to even the smallest positive thing and help that positive thing to grow, and that will help them. We also want to help them to be self-regulatory, because some of these kids will develop other disorders like ADHD or take more risks. But it is important that you help self-regulate them and tell them to stop and think when they're getting overly excited. Take a few deep breaths, tell me exactly what you're thinking. And even though they may be impulsive, just slow down, take a couple deep breaths, and tell me exactly what you're thinking, and we will work through it. Otherwise, they could be diagnosed with other things. And if they are, that's okay, that can be treated. But sometimes there is a correlation between these kids and kids that have ADHD and other symptoms. So focus on what the problem is, give them a choice when you can. You can clean your room now or in 10 minutes. That gives them some control back. You yourself have to choose your battles. You can't fight every single battle. Pick the ones that are the most important so they will listen, and they will be more likely to listen on the smaller battles as well. Give them structure, be consistent, stay connected to them, show them empathy and that you understand what they're going through. Avoid a power struggle. As they get older and older, the more that you fight with them, the more of a power struggle there's going to be. But instead, take time to listen and control your own emotions so that they're not overwhelmed, and so that you can approach that situation productively. And finally, show them some gentleness and playfulness. Exuberant children, like I said, are very gentle and responsive on the inside. They may have a hard outer shell, but they may have this very soft inside. If you make it into a game, if you make it into something that you do together, an activity you do together, they may be more willing to participate. So make it into a game, be gentle about it, be more playful about it, and how you parent really does matter. Pay attention to when they're task transitioning. So say, don't tell them immediately we're leaving, tell them we're going to leave in half an hour. Now we're going to leave in 10 minutes. Now we're going to leave in 2 minutes. So that way they can build up to that. And if there's natural consequences along the way, there may be, that's okay too, but don't argue, just to state what the rules are and create a connection. And yes, there are consequences when rules are broken, but avoid that power struggle above all. That's really, really important. So engage with them, acknowledge and validate their emotions, communicate with them, help them to problem solve, find the positives in them, and that each child has a gift, and then promote resilience, which we'll talk about in the next 2 talks as well, and then reevaluate and continue this process until the problem is solved. You want to communicate with them and teach them strength and resilience. Resilience will definitely come at all times because it's a muscle to be built. Sometimes you may not feel very resilient, but resilience exists inside each one of us. It's just a muscle that we have to keep building over time. And so we can thrive just like this flower is thriving, even if the conditions around us are not perfect, or the situation is not perfect, or there's a challenge. Through the next 2 presentations, we're going to talk more about how to communicate and how to teach them strength and resilience. Because resilience can be fostered even in young children and even in strong-willed children. You can get this amazing growth and flourishing and development if we communicate with them correctly and develop the right skills in our children. Mostly, it's important to know that before a problem occurs, you should be teaching them and training them by example, by being a good example, by being a mentor and a role model, not just a parent with all these rules and pointing your finger at them and telling them how much of a mistake and problems they're creating. During a problem, we need to love them the most and need to understand their perspective of why they've made this mistake. Love covers a multitude of sins, we know in the Bible, right? It doesn't mean that there's no consequences and there's no discipline. Of course there is, but discipline with love will go much further than discipline and anger or dictatorship or any of these things. And then after the problem has passed and you've solved it and talked about it and corrected it, you need to love by hope, and that there's hope for a better outcome next time around, and hope for a better future, and hope for the best outcome that you're going to have for these children that are entrusted to us. Here are some tips for good parenting. I won't go through each one, but basically, don't get physical with them. Don't get into a power struggle with them. Be a safe haven for them. Help yourself to understand that their brain is growing. They may look like they're taller and stronger, but their brain still has until age 25 or 26 to develop. There's a lot of impulsiveness. There's a lot of emotional roller coasters. There's a lot of anger. And some of that needs to be molded and fixed, yes, but be kind and positive in your parenting and it'll go much further. Again, we want to build that story of resilience. Resilience is a muscle. If we focus on their well-being, their motivation and drive, on good relationships, on their sense of purpose, and on their physical health, that resilience muscle will be built. And again, we'll talk about that in the next 2 lectures more. So remember 3 things is that what you do as parents matters. You have to adapt to your child at times because we all come with different temperaments, different behaviors. Don't treat all your children the same. You may have 2 or 3 children, even very close in age, growing in the same household that are very, very different. And so you have to adapt your parenting differently to each child. And you have to treat your children with respect in order for them to respect you also. They have to be treated with dignity and respect, again, they are children created in the image of God as well, and so we have to treat them with respect. Most importantly, leave room for prayer. Prayer gets a lot accomplished, of course, and so we should hold over them lots of prayer to see the fruits of our labor with time. These are books that I always recommend to parents that I work with, because again, they focus on the biblical, they focus on the developmental, so the spiritual, the biological. The Strength Switch is a really, really great book there in the middle about positive parenting and reframing and looking at their strengths rather than just looking at their weaknesses, and helping them to grow and to develop into positive adults as well. And then here's a page of resources with the American and the British Psychological Associations listed on there. The other sites are American, but they're wonderful resources. And they can, I'm sure you have comparable ones in the UK, but they're great resources universally. So that's why they're listed here. And they're also listed on my website. And here's my website and email. So you can contact me after this presentation as well. Thank you very much. I think we will turn it over to questions, but I will leave that up in case you need to write that down.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Christine. That was so beautiful to listen to, and filled with so much wisdom. I wish that I'd heard so much of that when I was a new parent more than 30 years ago. I have to be continually apologetic to my children for not being the best parent I could have been. I was going to ask about how we should treat children in the church as priests and servants, but those last slides were very, very helpful to train by example. I really feel that very strongly, that all of us as adults in the church have a responsibility to represent Christ to our children. To train with love, because our children often can be full of exuberance, let me put it like that, but also to train with hope, a real hope as priests and servants that God is at work in our children and he will perfect his own desires for them as we serve them with love and humility. All of this was so very, very helpful, and we will make this recording available. I do already have a couple of questions that people have written in the chats, and perhaps you would attend to them. The first is this: have developmental stages shifted in recent years, while we observe that children are exposed to the world much earlier than in years past? So do you think that children's developmental stages are changing, or is it that they're just encountering different stressors perhaps earlier on in their lives, and that's perhaps problematic? What would you say about that?
Yeah, it can affect definitely both things biologically and emotionally. For example, new research coming out on social media and children's use of social media. As you said, Abuna, that they're being exposed to things much more readily available at the tips of their fingers at all hours of the day, even when parents are sleeping and not able to monitor. So it is important that parents put some sort of parent controls on devices if they can, as much as they can, and limitations on these devices so that stuff is less filtered through. But we do know it creates things like emotional issues and even chemicals like in the brain. It's like a dopamine hit, for example, every time they're seeing somebody thumbs up their posts or whatever. And if they get less likes on something, then that may create more depression. They're also comparing themselves to a lot of other folks when things on social media, for example, are a highlight reel. They're not real life, because nobody's going to put, the fight with their kids that they just had on social media. They're putting the best of their kids when the kids get a prize or an award or something like that. So they see these things and the comparisons. It creates differences in the chemistry of the brain, maybe even the development of the brain, but definitely certainly things like psychological things like depression and anxiety are much more common and readily available when there is these things that are at their fingertips at all times. So limit them as much as possible. They can be tools, like any tool that can be used for good or for bad. And so to explain that to them, it's really important. and to explain the limitations and why it affects their brain, affects how their brain processes information, and affects emotions, like I said, depression, anxiety, other things as well. So really, really important to say these things and teach them real tools like resilience, like we'll talk about in the next two lectures.
Fantastic. A second question is that people sometimes talk about being a friend to your children, and this person understands about being a safe haven and not overreacting to problems. But what would you say about being a friend? Sometimes as they become more independent, they grow to feel that we aren't as close to them as we were. What do you think about this idea of being a friend to our children?
Um, I think that your parenting needs to evolve as they get older. You're not going to treat a 25-year-old like you would a 5-year-old. And as they develop and become adults themselves and have their own families, your relationship as a parent needs to change. I'll be talking more about that as we talk about the lifespan stuff in the last lecture. But your parenting needs to change and evolve as they grow into more wisdom and guidance rather than like disciplinary measures that you would give for a younger or a smaller child. The friendship piece, you're not on an equal playing field still. There's still a somewhat of a power differential between a parent and a child. But as that child becomes an adult and their issues are similar to you as an adult, you may feel that sense of camaraderie that you would have with a friend. However, there still needs to be mutual respect and understanding that there's still somewhat small parent, child respect differential or power differential, but the similarities may occur more. You may even notice that with, let's say, younger siblings or younger cousins. You become closer to them as they grow older and they become adults. That age difference seems to disappear a little bit. So it's something similar or akin to that, but there's still a difference of a parent and a child. But your parenting needs to evolve and grow as they evolve and grow as well.
Fantastic, fantastic. Another question is, if I feel that my son always puts pressure on me, sometimes I can manage, but if I'm overloaded with other life stresses, I find it very hard to cope with him. How can we manage this in a more fruitful way? And is there a particular message in this behavior from a child when they do seem to be putting pressure on us when we're already struggling?
It's okay to say no. It's okay to say no to things. I wouldn't say no to everything, and I wouldn't say yes to everything. If they're putting pressure on you, let's say for a time constraint, then maybe make a time where you can take them out, just you and that child one-on-one. I always try to tell parents, because your children are different, sometimes parents clump all their children together just in the effort to save time or energy or whatever. But it's also important to take them out individually and spend time with them individually so that you can see their individual needs and figure out a way to maneuver that efficiently. Yes, time is a big constraint for sure. And it can be difficult to manage lots of different things. So parents, as much as you can, don't overwhelm your plate. Your children are obviously a priority, if not the number one priority. So don't acquiesce to everything that they want you to do, but at the same time, don't say no to everything either. Figure out what you're trying to say no to and make sure, again, you're not getting into a power struggle, and say, I can't talk about this right now. I have a meeting. I will talk to you about this, tonight at 8 o'clock. I will talk to you about this. Or I'm really busy this week. I have deadlines, I have work, I have whatever. But on Friday, on the weekend, let's sit down and have a chat about this. And then follow through. Don't say you're going to sit with them and talk about it on Friday if you don't intend to. If it's urgent, then yes, sometimes you have to drop everything and do it. But hopefully that doesn't happen a lot. And not everything can be with that level of urgency.
Fantastic. Another question is perhaps the other way around. How are we supposed to help our parents when they are struggling? Or even, I suppose, how do we allow our children of different ages to give care to us, in a way that humbles ourselves before them, I suppose? How does that other way go?
Yeah, so again, relationships are through the lifespan. And so there's a point in time where They call those, middle generation, the sandwich generation, because you're taking care of the elderly parents and you're taking care of the young children at the same time. And those parents in middle age are very exhausted because they're doing both. You cannot, this is a very popular saying in the US for therapists, you cannot pour out from an empty cup. So you have to find a way to refill your cup, and find meaning and purpose in your own world so that you are able to care for your children and care for your parents. If you have siblings that can help you divide up the duties, if you can get a nurse or something to come in and help, sometimes that may be necessary. Don't try to be everything for everyone and burn out in the process. I've given many lectures on burnout. That could be a whole separate lecture just by itself. But you truly can't care for anyone effectively if you're not caring for yourself first. And I'm not saying be selfish. I'm saying make sure that you're getting enough rest and food and, taking care of yourself first, mentally, physically, psychologically, spiritually, before you can take care of others. And try to divvy up the duties as much as you can, divide it up, so that you're not doing everything by yourself. It takes a village to care for a child. It takes a village to care for our elderly parents. So make sure you're doing that.
And then just two final questions. The first one is, at which age will we expect as parents that our children will start to focus on their spiritual life with God? I just want to say, as a priest, that I expect the youngest children before they can speak, to begin to experience a sense of love and joy and peace in the church among God's people. And I expect the smallest children, as a priest, and I see this, thank God, in my own church, I expect the smallest children to be expressing their own spirituality. So from my perspective, I want to hear yours, but from mine, I think this is an example of where we must be the example. And we must do our, I often say to people, we have to do our spiritually out loud in front of our children. They can't guess what's happening inside our mind. We could be praying all the time, but our children can't see that. We have to do it out loud so they can participate with us. But what do you say? What do you think?
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. When they have to see good examples in us, in order to give that to our children, in everything, in our behavior, in our mannerisms, in how we think, and how we help others. And spirituality can come from all of those things. If we're serving in the church, I know I saw my parents serve all my life, since a very young age, in all different capacities, and that was developed in me. So we can show them by being good examples. There is a lot of research on childhood development and development of spirituality and the concept of God. It may start off really concretely, just because the brain is still processing. And it may be very black and white, and they may read the stories and take them literally and all of those things, and they're not looking at the deeper understandings of those stories. So we know the stories, for example, we're in Jonah's fast. We know that those stories are real. But then we have contemplations on them and meditations on those stories, and we go deeper. And that develops as the brain develops, into a deeper understanding of concepts like not running away from God, and listening to what God is telling us, and understanding that we each have a talent and a purpose, and we should manifest those. So those lessons come later on, whereas younger children will just read the story of Noah, or Jonah, I should say, and the big fish and all of those things. They'll understand it concretely initially, and it will become more and more abstract with time, less black and white, just as they develop and grow. But as Abuna said, love and all those universal, spiritual, important concepts, they're there from the get-go. And they can be manifested in how the parent, holds the infant child and cares for them. All of that stuff is absorbed right from the beginning.
I will say that, I am very interested in the spirituality of children. I read a lot around that. I listen to lectures on that. And from my own experience, not taking over this just in one moment, when I see children, small children, toddlers, standing with a smile to receive communion, I believe this is a spiritual experience they're having. When they are comfortable and happy, I have children wandering all around my church during the liturgy. I want them to feel this is the place I am safe more than anywhere else, and I feel all of this is spiritual. This is an important aspect of it. But the final question, because there'll be time for other questions next Wednesday and the Wednesday after. Someone asks, how can I deal with a challenging child of 12 years old who argues about many of the advice I give them, either spiritual or practical? How do we parent a child who wants to keep asking questions and isn't happy with our answers? Perhaps that's what we're saying.
Yeah, so I think that goes back to that strong-willed child that we were talking about there towards the end of the presentation. And these children are seen as stubborn or difficult to deal with. And again, how do you turn that into focusing on their strength? So thinking that they are strong-willed, that may mean that they're not going to be pushed around easily by the world outside. So using that to their benefit, where you can give them a choice, give them a choice, because they want to feel like they're leaders. If they can, maybe lead brothers and sisters or lead some sort of service or something like that, where they feel like they're a leader, that can help break some of that apart. And sometimes, unfortunately, there are natural consequences. If you tell your child a million times, take your coat to school with you, and they refuse, and then they, are standing outside in the cold, that is a natural consequence that sometimes they may have to experience to understand that mom and dad are right. I'm not saying leave them in the cold until they get frostbite, but at the same time, sometimes there are natural consequences, to not listening to what a parent is saying. Also try to understand their perspective, be empathetic. Why are they so stubborn and sticking their heels in this regard? Why is this so important to them? Try to understand it from their perspective. You'll be able to argue a lot better your perspective once you've understood theirs.
Fantastic. Let me just show my screen again, because we'll close in prayer. But I really want to thank you for this presentation. It's really been useful and helpful. And for those who are here, still people are joining. Maybe next time I need to make it very clear it's 7 p.m. British time. But I'm very happy that we've had up to 44 people wanting to become better parents, better servants, to deal with our children better. Thank God for that concern. This recording will be made available. I will upload it probably tomorrow. There is a Facebook group that I have started a year ago, perhaps now, Coptic Orthodox Mental Health Awareness. There's not a lot of traffic there, but it's a place where if you join, you will at least get notification. Here in the Diocese of the Midlands in the UK, we are very concerned that we become a therapeutic community, a community that helps every member of our church, every person that we come in touch with, experience the sort of well-being that Dr. Christine has been speaking about. And so we are going to continue having presentations like this and other learning opportunities, so that we, all of us, become better at the service that God has given us as parents, servants, members of the church, and as priests. Thank you again for this wonderful presentation. I'm going to turn the recording off now, and then I will just closing prayer.